The year is 1863. The American South is losing a war it cannot afford to lose. Union naval blockades have strangled Confederate ports from Virginia to Texas, cutting off weapons, food, medicine, and the last threads of economic survival. Cotton rots in warehouses. Soldiers go without boots. Cities begin to starve. The Confederate States of America need a miracle. And somewhere in the shipyards of Mobile, Alabama, 3 men believe they have built one. It doesn't look like much at first glance. 40 feet long, 4 feet wide, made from the boiler of a steam locomotive, hammered and bent into the shape of a cigar. It sits low in the water, so low that from a distance, it nearly vanishes beneath the surface. That is, in fact, the entire point. Its name is the H.L. Hunley, and it is about to change the history of warfare forever. To understand what this machine represented, you have to understand what naval combat looked like in 1863. Ships were massive, heavily armored, bristling with cannons. They fought in the open water, visible from miles away, trading volleys until one side sank or surrendered. The idea of an underwater vessel, invisible, silent, attacking from below, was not just unconventional. To most military commanders of the era, it was pure fantasy. But the men who built the Hunley were not dreamers. They were engineers. Horace Lawson Hunley was a New Orleans lawyer and businessman with an obsession, and the money to fund it. James McClintock and Baxter Watson were machinists who had already built 2 earlier submarine prototypes, both of which had failed. The Hunley was their 3rd attempt. Their most ambitious. Their most dangerous. The vessel was designed to be propelled by 8 men turning a hand-cranked propeller from the inside. A 9th man, the commander, would steer from the front, watching through small iron viewports barely large enough to see through. The interior was less than 4 feet in diameter. There was no room to stand. Barely room to breathe. To dive, the crew would open ballast tanks, compartments that flooded with water, pulling the vessel beneath the surface. To rise, they would pump the water back out. The margin for error was measured not in feet, but in seconds. One wrong valve. One moment of panic. One unexpected wave. And the water would come in, and it would not stop. Historical records indicate that even during early trials, the crew experienced temperatures inside the hull that caused them to sweat profusely, rapidly depleting the limited oxygen supply. The Hunley carried no air tanks, no mechanical ventilation. The crew breathed what they brought with them. When the air ran out, the mission ended. One way or another. In the summer of 1863, Confederate military officials transferred the Hunley from Mobile to Charleston, South Carolina, the most aggressively blockaded port on the eastern seaboard. The Union fleet sat just outside the harbor, an iron wall of warships that had reduced Charleston's maritime commerce to almost nothing. The Hunley was towed overland on a flat car, in secret, arriving in Charleston in August 1863. General P.G.T. Beauregard, the Confederate commander in Charleston, received the vessel with cautious optimism. He had heard about its potential. He had also heard whispers about what had happened during its earlier trials. Those whispers, it turned out, were only the beginning. By the time the Hunley arrived in Charleston, it had already survived things that should have ended it. But what happened next, in the calm waters of Charleston Harbor, would shock even the men who built it. August 29, 1863. The waters of Charleston Harbor are calm. The afternoon sun reflects off the surface in long, golden strips. From the docks, a small group of Confederate officers watch as the Hunley prepares for a routine dive test. Lieutenant John Payne of the Confederate Navy has been assigned as the vessel's commander. He is an experienced officer, but he has spent very little time inside a submarine. Very few people have. What happens next takes less than 60 seconds. Historical accounts from witnesses on the dock describe what they saw. The Hunley began to submerge, and then simply did not come back up. The exact sequence of events inside the hull remains a matter of historical debate, but surviving records and later investigations suggest that during the dive, a crewman accidentally stepped on, or became entangled with, the lever controlling the forward ballast tank. The tank flooded faster than it could be compensated for. The bow tilted sharply downward. The water came in. Lieutenant Payne, positioned near the open hatch at the rear of the vessel, managed to escape. 2 other crewmen also escaped through hatches before the Hunley fully submerged. 5 men did not. Their names were Frank Doyle, John Kelly, Michael Kane, Nicholas Davis, and Absalom Williams. They were sailors, ordinary men, serving in an extraordinary and lethal experiment. They drowned in approximately 30 feet of water, trapped inside a 40-foot iron tube on a calm afternoon, within sight of the dock. The Confederate military recovered the vessel. They pumped out the water. They pulled out the dead. And then, and this is the detail that makes this story unlike almost any other in military history, they decided to send it out again. General Beauregard ordered the Hunley repaired and recommissioned. The logic, brutal as it sounds in retrospect, was straightforward. The Confederacy was running out of options. The blockade was strangling Charleston. If the Hunley could reach the Union fleet, if it could sink even one enemy warship, it might change the balance of the war. 5 lives weighed against that possibility. In the calculus of 1863, was a trade some commanders were willing to make. A new crew was assembled. New volunteers. Men who knew, at least in rough terms, what had happened to the last crew. They climbed in anyway. The Hunley resumed training operations through September 1863. By most accounts, the vessel performed adequately during surface runs. But every dive was a negotiation with catastrophe. The crew rotated the hand crank in near-total darkness, breathing recycled air, watching the tiny compass mounted near the commander's viewport, trusting that the man at the front could navigate them back to the surface before the oxygen gave out. Some historians believe the psychological pressure alone was extraordinary. 8 men, locked in an iron tube barely wide enough to turn around in, performing physical labor in the dark, beneath the surface of a harbor, with Union warships somewhere above them. The records from this period are sparse. But what happened on October 15, 1863 is documented. The vessel went down a second time. But this time, the man who lost his life was the one whose name it carried. Horace Lawson Hunley arrived in Charleston in October 1863, personally convinced that the submarine bearing his name was being mishandled. He was a difficult man to argue with. He had financed the vessel. He had overseen its construction. And he believed, perhaps more than anyone, in what it could do. According to surviving correspondence, Hunley wrote to Confederate officials expressing frustration with how the military crews were operating his invention. He requested, and received, permission to take command himself. It was the last decision he ever made. On the morning of October 15, 1863, Horace Hunley led a crew of 7 men into the harbor for a dive exercise. The vessel submerged normally. It did not resurface. When the Hunley failed to return, Confederate divers were sent to find it. They located the vessel on the harbor floor, sitting at a sharp downward angle, bow buried in the mud, stern elevated, as if the vessel had attempted a steep dive and never recovered. When the hatch was opened, the scene inside was described by those who witnessed it as something they would never forget. Horace Hunley was found at the forward viewport, his hands raised. Historical accounts suggest he may have been attempting to open the forward hatch in his final moments. The crew behind him were found at their stations. The candles they used for interior light, the Hunley had no electric lighting, had burned out completely, suggesting the crew had survived long enough to exhaust both their candles and their air. 8 men. Dead in the mud of Charleston Harbor. Among them, the inventor himself, entombed inside his own creation. The cause of the second sinking has been debated by historians ever since. Some believe Hunley, unfamiliar with the military crew's specific procedures, may have made an error during the dive sequence. Others suggest a mechanical failure in the ballast system. According to surviving Confederate engineering reports, the forward ballast tank showed signs of having been left in the open position, which would have caused the catastrophic bow-down angle found by the divers. What is certain is this: 13 men were now dead. The submarine had sunk twice in fewer than 2 months. Its inventor was among the casualties. General Beauregard, who had initially been cautiously optimistic about the vessel, now had serious doubts. According to historical records, he wrote in his official communications that the Hunley appeared to be more dangerous to those who use it than to the enemy. He was not wrong. Horace Hunley was buried in Magnolia Cemetery in Charleston with full military honors. The Confederate government officially mourned the inventor's death while simultaneously ordering the Hunley raised from the harbor floor for the second time. Repaired. Recommissioned. Ready for a third crew. The logic had not changed. The blockade had not lifted. The war had not paused to grieve. 13 men dead. 2 sinkings. 1 inventor buried in his own machine. And yet, the most astonishing chapter of this story was still to come. Because what happened next reveals something deeply unsettling about the nature of war, desperation, and the human will to volunteer for the impossible. There is a question that historians, psychologists, and military scholars have returned to again and again when studying the Hunley. Who volunteers for a machine that has already killed 13 of its own crew? The answer, uncomfortable as it is, tells us something profound about the nature of war, loyalty, and desperation. Lieutenant George E. Dixon was 23 years old when he was assigned command of the Hunley following the second sinking. He was from Mobile, Alabama. Before the war, he had worked as a steamboat engineer, which meant he understood, better than most soldiers, the mechanical principles behind the vessel he was being asked to command. He had, by some accounts, been involved in the Hunley's early development. He had seen the vessel up close. He knew its history. He volunteered anyway. Dixon has been described in surviving letters and military records as calm, methodical, and deeply committed to the Confederate cause. He was also, according to those who served with him, a man who inspired trust. When he asked for volunteers to crew the Hunley for a third time, men came forward. Their motivations, reconstructed from letters, military records, and later historical research, were varied, but they cluster around several themes. Some were driven by genuine belief in the Confederate cause. Charleston was their home. The blockade was starving their families. The Hunley represented the only realistic weapon capable of breaking it. If they could sink even one Union ship, if they could scatter the blockade fleet, even briefly, the mission was worth the risk. Some were driven by something harder to define. The Hunley was famous within Confederate military circles by October 1863. It was dangerous, yes. It was also unlike anything that had ever existed. For certain men, engineers, adventurers, men who found in machinery what others found in religion, it represented something irresistible. And some, historical records suggest, simply had no better options. The Confederate Army in late 1863 was a brutal, exhausted institution. Combat casualties were staggering. Disease was rampant. For a soldier on the front lines, the calculated danger of the Hunley may not have seemed dramatically worse than what waited for him in the trenches. The crew Dixon, assembled for the third iteration of the Hunley, was composed largely of men from the Confederate submarine service and naval volunteers. Their names, recovered through meticulous archival research in the decades since the war, were Frank Collins, Joseph Ridgway, James Wicks, Arnold Becker, C. Simpkins, and 2 others whose identities remained uncertain until the vessel's recovery in 2000. These were not nameless men. They were young, most in their 20s. Several had families. At least 2 had recently emigrated from Europe, drawn to America by opportunity and caught, like so many immigrants of their generation, in a war that was not originally their own. They trained through November and December of 1863. They ran surface drills in the harbor. They practiced dive sequences, carefully, methodically, under Dixon's supervision. General Beauregard, who had now forbidden the vessel from making any unauthorized dives, watched the training with a combination of hope and unease. By early February 1864, Dixon believed his crew was ready. He sent a formal request to Confederate command, permission to attempt the mission, to leave the harbor, to find the Union fleet, to do what the Hunley had been built to do. The permission was granted. On the evening of February 17, 1864, the Hunley slipped out of Charleston Harbor and into the darkness of the Atlantic. What happened in the next few hours would make history. and then vanish from it for 136 years. The night is cold. The water is black. At approximately 7 p.m. on February 17, 1864, the H.L. Hunley moves through the waters outside Charleston Harbor under a clear, moonlit sky. Dixon and his crew of 7 have been training for this moment for months. The target is the USS Housatonic, a 1,240-ton Union sloop of war anchored approximately 4 miles offshore as part of the blockade fleet. The Housatonic is a formidable ship. She carries 17 heavy guns and a crew of more than 150 men. She is exactly the kind of vessel that has made the Union blockade impenetrable. Lieutenant Dixon intends to change that. The Hunley's weapon is as unconventional as the vessel itself, a spar torpedo. This is not a torpedo in the modern sense. It is a copper cylinder packed with approximately 135 pounds of black powder, mounted on the end of a long iron spar that extends from the Hunley's bow. The plan is to ram the spar into the hull of the target ship, below the waterline, then back away and detonate the charge with a pull cord. In theory, it is elegant. In practice, it requires the Hunley to approach one of the most heavily armed ships in the Union fleet close enough to make physical contact. In the dark, silently, without being seen. At approximately 8:45 p.m., a lookout aboard the Housatonic spotted something in the water. Accounts from surviving crew members, recorded in later naval investigations, describe seeing what looked like a long plank or log moving against the current, and then realizing, with growing alarm, that it was moving with purpose. The Housatonic's crew reacted quickly. Sailors rushed to their guns. Others attempted to slip the anchor chain to maneuver the ship away. According to the official Union naval inquiry conducted after the attack, the Housatonic managed to fire small arms at the approaching vessel, but the heavy guns could not be depressed low enough to target something so close to the waterline. It was too late. The Hunley made contact with the Housatonic's hull near the starboard quarter, the right rear section of the ship, slightly aft of the powder magazine. The spar drove into the wooden planking. The charge was set. Dixon ordered his crew to back away. The detonation, when it came, was catastrophic. Witnesses on nearby ships described a column of water shooting into the air, followed by a deep, concussive boom that carried across the harbor. The Housatonic, a warship that had withstood combat and Atlantic storms, sank in approximately 5 minutes. 5 Union sailors were killed. More than 150 others survived, most by climbing into the rigging as the ship went down beneath them. It was, by any measure, a historic moment. For the first time in the history of warfare, a submarine had sunk an enemy warship in combat. The Hunley had done exactly what it was designed to do. And then, something went wrong. Dixon was supposed to signal the shore with a blue light to confirm the mission's success. Historical records indicate that the signal was seen. Confederate observers on shore later testified that they saw the Hunley's light approximately 9 p.m., shortly after the sinking of the Housatonic. The Hunley never came home. It was never seen again, not by Confederate eyes, not by Union search parties, not by anyone, for 136 years. The Housatonic lay on the harbor floor. The Hunley had vanished. And the question that would haunt naval historians for over a century was only just beginning to form. What happened to those 8 men in the minutes after their greatest triumph? The disappearance of the Hunley was, in some ways, immediately overshadowed by the magnitude of what it had accomplished. In the weeks following February 17, 1864, Confederate newspapers celebrated the sinking of the Housatonic as a proof of concept, evidence that a new era of underwater warfare had arrived. The Union Navy, for its part, issued urgent directives to all blockade vessels: watch for submarines, deploy lookout boats, avoid anchoring in predictable positions. The Hunley had changed naval doctrine forever, and it had not even survived to see it. Lieutenant Dixon and his crew were listed as missing. Then, quietly, as the weeks passed without word, as presumed dead. The Confederacy, grinding toward its final collapse, did not have the resources to mount a serious search. The war ended in April 1865. The Hunley became a footnote, a remarkable one, but a footnote nonetheless. A curiosity buried beneath the events that followed. For the next century and more, the wreck of the Hunley existed largely in the realm of legend. Military historians knew it had sunk somewhere in the waters off Charleston. Divers made occasional, unsuccessful searches. Maritime archaeologists speculated about its location. Various theories circulated about what might have happened, some plausible, some fanciful, none supported by physical evidence. Then, in 1980, a writer and undersea explorer named Clive Cussler, better known to most people as the author of adventure novels, decided to find it. Cussler funded multiple search expeditions over 15 years, scouring the seafloor off Charleston with magnetometers and side-scan sonar. The search was painstaking. The seafloor in that region is a graveyard of wreckage, Civil War era ships, navigation hazards, debris accumulated over more than a century. Separating a 40-foot iron submarine from the noise of that environment required extraordinary patience. On May 3, 1995, Cussler's team found it. The Hunley was located approximately 4 miles offshore, in roughly 30 feet of water, not far from where the Housatonic had gone down. It was partially buried in silt, oriented at an angle, its iron hull corroded but largely intact. The discovery was announced to immediate international attention. Naval historians, archaeologists, and Civil War scholars converged on Charleston. The state of South Carolina, the United States Navy, and the National Park Service entered into an agreement to raise and preserve the vessel. A non-profit organization, the Friends of the Hunley, was established to coordinate the recovery. On August 8, 2136 years after it disappeared, the H.L. Hunley was raised from the seafloor in a specially constructed truss, lifted by crane, and brought into a conservation facility in North Charleston. What was inside astonished everyone. The crew was still there. All 8 men, Dixon and the 7 who had volunteered to follow him, remained at their stations, their skeletal remains preserved by the cold, low-oxygen environment of the silt in which the vessel had been buried. Their bones were found in the positions they had occupied during the mission, cranking the propeller, manning the ballast pumps, steering the vessel. Personal artifacts were recovered alongside them. Pocket watches, uniform buttons, and, found in the hand of Lieutenant George Dixon himself, something that no one had expected, a gold coin. A $20 gold piece, bent and scarred by what forensic analysis would later confirm was a bullet impact. According to local accounts that had circulated for decades but been treated as legend, Dixon had carried the coin as a good luck charm, a gift from a woman named Queenie Bennett, who had pressed it into his hands before he left for the front. The coin had reportedly deflected a bullet at the Battle of Shiloh in 1862, saving his leg. He had carried it through 2 years of war. He had carried it into the Hunley. He had it in his hand when he died. The legend, against all probability, was true. The men had been found. Their story had been recovered. But the most important question, the question that forensic scientists, engineers, and historians would spend the next 2 decades trying to answer, remained completely open. What, exactly, had killed them? The recovery of the Hunley in 2000 was not an ending. It was the beginning of one of the most complex forensic investigations in the history of maritime archaeology. The vessel was placed in a specially designed conservation tank filled with fresh water at the Warren Lash Conservation Center in North Charleston, where it remains today, slowly releasing the salts and corrosion products that have accumulated in its iron hull over more than 150 years. The process of conservation alone is expected to take decades. But even as conservators worked on the hull, a separate team of scientists, historians, and forensic specialists began working on the question that everyone wanted answered. Why did the Hunley not come home? The crew's skeletal remains were carefully recovered and subjected to forensic analysis. What the scientists found was, in its own way, as mysterious as the disappearance itself. There were no signs of traumatic injury, no crushed bones, no evidence of the kind of physical damage that would be expected if the vessel had been struck by a Union weapon, or caught in the blast wave of its own torpedo, or crushed by water pressure. The men appeared to have died, for lack of a better term, quietly. They were found at their stations. They had not attempted to escape through the hatches. They had not crowded toward the exits. They were simply there. 8 men, in the positions they had occupied during the mission, as if they had fallen asleep at their posts. This single observation has driven the forensic debate ever since. The most widely discussed hypothesis among researchers in the years following the recovery is rooted in the physics of the explosion itself. When the Hunley detonated 135 pounds of black powder against the hull of the Housatonic, the vessel was close, very close. Exactly how close remains a matter of calculation and debate, but some researchers believe the Hunley may have been within 20 to 30 feet of the explosion when it detonated. In 2017, a team of researchers from Duke University published findings suggesting that the blast wave from the torpedo detonation would have traveled through the water and into the iron hull of the Hunley at extraordinary speed, faster than the crew could have perceived it, faster than they could have reacted to it. The overpressure wave, they concluded, would have caused severe, potentially fatal trauma to the crew's internal organs, lungs, brain, blood vessels, without leaving the kind of marks on bone that standard forensic examination would detect. In other words, the crew may have been killed by their own weapon. Instantly. Without warning. Without pain. According to the study, published in PLOS 1, the overpressure experienced inside the Hunley's hull at the moment of detonation may have been sufficient to cause fatal injuries to all 8 men simultaneously, leaving them slumped at their stations, the vessel intact, the mission completed, and no one alive to steer it home. It is a compelling theory. It is not, however, a proven one. Other researchers have raised important objections. Some point out that the blue signal light seen by Confederate observers after the explosion suggests that at least one crew member, almost certainly Dixon, was alive and functional several minutes after the detonation. If the blast wave had killed the crew instantly, who sent the signal? Some historians believe the signal light was seen before the detonation, not after, and that the timeline recorded by Confederate observers may have been imprecise. Others suggest that Dixon may have sent the signal while already critically injured, dying in the minutes that followed. The exact cause of death remains unknown. Additional questions circle the mystery like satellites. Why did the vessel sink where it did? Offshore, at an angle, partially buried, rather than closer to the harbor entrance where it might have been found sooner? Was it struck by debris from the Housatonic? Did it take on water through a damaged hatch seal? Did the crew, incapacitated but not immediately killed, slowly lose consciousness as the oxygen ran out, the same fate that had claimed the 2 earlier crews? Each question opens onto another. The Hunley has been studied more intensively than almost any other artifact of the American Civil War, and still, 160 years after it disappeared, it has not fully given up its answer. The men have been recovered. The science has been applied. And yet the final chapter of the Hunley *S story is not about what killed 8 men in the darkness of Charleston Harbor. It is about what their deaths, and the deaths of the 13 before them, changed forever. In April 2004, the crew of the H.L. Hunley was buried. 140 years after their deaths, Lieutenant George Dixon and his 7 crewmen were interred with full military honors at Magnolia Cemetery in Charleston, the same cemetery where Horace Hunley himself had been buried in 1863. Thousands of people lined the streets of Charleston to watch the funeral procession. Living history reenactors in Confederate uniforms served as pallbearers. Cannons fired a salute. It was, by any measure, a remarkable moment, the close of a story that had taken a century and a half to reach its ending. But the story of the Hunley does not end in a cemetery. It ends, if it ends at all, in every submarine that has been built since. The H.L. Hunley did not win the Civil War. The Confederate blockade was not broken. Charleston fell to Union forces in February 1865, almost exactly 1 year after the Hunley's final mission. The Confederacy collapsed 2 months later. The vessel's impact on the war itself was, in practical terms, negligible. Its impact on the history of warfare was incalculable. Within decades of the Civil War, every major naval power on Earth was developing submarine programs. The lessons learned, in principle, if not always in direct lineage, from the Hunley's design informed the thinking of engineers in Britain, France, Germany, and the United States as they worked toward the first truly practical military submarines of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. By World War I, submarine warfare had become one of the defining strategic realities of the conflict. German U-boats threatened to strangle British supply lines, an almost exact inversion of the situation the Hunley had been built to address in 1863. By World War II, submarines had become instruments capable of determining the outcomes of entire oceanic campaigns. Today, nuclear-powered submarines carry ballistic missiles capable of destroying cities. They patrol beneath the Arctic ice, beneath the Pacific, beneath the Atlantic, in near total silence, descendants, in concept if not in mechanism, of a 40-foot iron tube crewed by 8 men with a hand crank and a candle. The Hunley was first. It was crude, terrifying, and lethally dangerous to its own crew. It killed 21 men before it killed a single enemy sailor. By almost any rational measure, it should never have been sent out at all. And yet, the question that the Hunley forces us to ask, the question that sits beneath all the forensic analysis and the archival research and the forensic arguments about blast waves, is a harder one. What do we do with the fact that the men who built it knew it was dangerous, and built it anyway? That the men who crewed it knew 13 of their predecessors had died inside it, and climbed in anyway? That a military command watched 2 crews drown in harbor tests and ordered a 3rd crew assembled? Some historians frame this as the logic of desperation, a dying nation making irrational decisions under unbearable pressure. Others see it differently. They see men who understood, with unusual clarity, that the history of human progress is inseparable from the willingness to enter machines that might kill you. Every first flight, every first dive, every first launch into space. Someone was first. And being first, in almost every case in human history, meant accepting a risk that those who came later would never have to face in the same form. The H.L. Hunley sits today in its conservation tank in North Charleston, still giving up its secrets one molecule at a time. The work of the conservators is expected to continue for decades. New forensic analyses are conducted regularly as technology advances. Each year, the vessel yields a little more of what it knows. George Dixon's gold coin, bent by a Confederate bullet at Shiloh, carried through 2 years of war, found in his hand on the floor of Charleston Harbor, is on display at the Warren Lash Conservation Center. It is, by any standard of historical improbability, an extraordinary object. A coin that survived a bullet, survived a war, survived 136 years underwater, and came back to tell a story. The men who carried it did not survive. But their story did. The records survived. The mystery endures. And somewhere beneath the surface of what we think we know about human courage and human desperation, the Hunley is still asking its question. A question that has no clean answer, only the cold, dark water, and the silence of 8 men at their stations, waiting to be understood.